The name's Puck. You should always introduce yourself before asking another person's name.
He's small, he's kind of blue, he likes trouble, and his personality is that of a rambunctious teenager. Wait, are you thinking about a Smurf? Well, you're wrong, buddy, because we're talking about the greatest and strongest and wisest character in all of Berserk. Puck. Puck has been with us and Guts since day one, and is perhaps the only reason that the Black Swordsman didn't entirely become a demon like the man he seeks to kill. It's not an exaggeration to say that causality might have been at play when Guts came across Puck, but that doesn't mean that everyone likes what he's doing either. Chestnut Puck, while hilarious, has left the fan base divided about the character's role in the story, but we'd argue that Puck remains just as relevant as ever, and that's because of where he comes from, what that signifies, and why he leaves his home in the first place. It might seem like a joke to you, but Puck could actually be the true protagonist of Berserk like he loves to say he is, so without further ado, let's get into it. This is Puck's Origins Explored. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. But first, a history lesson, sort of. Puck in the real world. If the name Puck is one you've heard thrown around recently, then it's most likely because of God of War Ragnarok, which revealed that Mimir was actually a part of an English legend before he migrated to the Norse realms. Of course, his appearance is nowhere near that of the original Puck, and that's because there is some degree of debate as to what Puck even is. Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable refers to Puck as a domestic fairy with a particularly mischievous nature. Also known as Robin Goodfellow, he was the English counterpart of the Scottish Brownie and was also the jester of the fabled fairy court. Domestic spirits of home and hearth aren't exclusive to the English Isles. In the Roman Empire, lares were believed to be household spirits who bore witness to important family events and were supposed to be treated like a member of the household almost. Domestic spirits of England were more like pixies in this regard, in that they would often pull pranks on their home dwellers whilst helping out with household chores. Their mischief generally came from a harmless place, but became such an issue for the people they subjected it to that they came to be seen as nuisances. Nowhere is this more evident than in Shakespeare's seminal comedic play A Midsummer Night's Dream, where Puck's mischief causes the fairy queen to fall in love with a play actor with a jackass's head. Also, the king could swipe her bodyguard. You couldn't write better material in the English they spoke in Shakespeare's time, even if you wanted to, but this should give you an idea of the inspiration behind Kentaro Miura's version of Puck. The Puck we see in Berserk is actually an amalgamation of a few different mythical creatures. He's a combination of an elf, a pixie, and a fairy, and we'll explain how that all works as the video goes on. But yes, this is the basis for the character of Puck in the world of Berserk, which we'd argue is pretty faithfully represented in the story because Miura's Puck is nothing if not mischievous. Puck is the burdock-wielding, self-appointed Yoda of this story, and we personally are extremely here for it. But that's enough with the history lesson. Let's dive into Miura's creation and see how he used this creature from European and British folklore in his dark fantasy tale. He's rescued not out of a good heart, but as a means to an end. Puck's introduction to Berserk and Guts. Puck is the second major character we meet in the very first chapter of Berserk, titled The Black Swordsman, and to be honest, that alone should tell you that he's crucial to the story. Any character that's introduced that early on and is still breathing usually has a good reason for doing just that, but we'll talk about all that down the road. For now, let's take a look at said appearance. After taking care of the female apostle that finished Corcus off during the eclipse, pun very much intended, Guts arrives at the city of Coca, looking for his next target. He enters the local tavern, where he observes the henchmen of said target tormenting an elf they had captured. These thugs were throwing knives at the poor creature as some sort of sick wager, and though the men in the tavern felt bad for the elf, they didn't dare interfere. Even when the mayor cannot stop the thugs in service of the person holding Coca Castle, it was best to not get involved. So naturally, Guts got involved. He paid the innkeeper and apologized for the trouble he was about to cause before pulling out a sick mechanical crossbow. As this was happening, the thug harassing Puck pulled out another throwing knife to lob at his head, and this ticked off the elf something proper. Despite being tied up and unable to escape, Puck threatened the fathead to bring it on and untie him so he could chew through his arteries. That is definitely not elfin behavior, in case you were wondering, and there's a reason for that. It is very clear that Miura initially intended for his story to have a hard fantasy setting. After the conclusion of the Black Swordsman arc, it becomes evident that magical creatures creatures and magic itself are rather tough for the faithless to perceive. The biggest example of this is Farnace, who, as an ardent adherent of the Holy See, couldn't even see Puck in the beginning. It took her going through Guts' Night of Terrors to realize that such things as spirits and demons exist, which implies that a person's astral horizons are only expanded when they come into contact with a person residing within the interstice, like Guts. Characters like Judo, who believe in fairy tales as much as reality, have met elves before, and we'll get to that in a bit, but there is also another possibility. One could also argue that if an apostle was active in an area, then people would be more willing to accept the existence of supernatural beings. An example of this is the apostle Weil, whose men were only loyal to him out of pure terror. They were terrified of his strength and form as an apostle, and as a result, were closer to the edges of the great beyond. The city of Coca was being ruled by an apostle as well, which is why Guts was there in the first place, and it could very well be that the people knew their Baron was a demonic reincarnate, but that doesn't seem to be true, because, as you'll see later in this video, only the mayor of the city seemed to be aware of the full extent of his master's true nature, and even that can be debated. So this could be one of the reasons why Guts was so unbothered by the fact that these thugs were harassing an elf. It was supposed to be normal for the world, not just him. And this is likely one of the reasons why Puck from the first arc of Berserk feels so different from the Puck we know today. Once Miura fleshed out his world and realized what its 3 layers were going to be, and how he was going to overlap them with one another, a change in his personality might have been necessary. But because we're still in the era where everyone loved Puck unanimously, we'll continue with this story. As the brash elf struggled against his bonds and braced for the cold embrace of death, a crossbow bolt struck his tormentors square in the head. Before the deceased thugs' bodies could respond, Guts introduced them to the same fate, and left one guy alive to deliver a message to his master. That message was to tell him that the Black Swordsman had arrived. Puck watched all this unfold with a fraction of concern for his tormentors, but a pie chart full of fear for his savior as he loudly warned Guts about a thug he had missed. The Black Swordsman seemed to heed the call and bifurcated his attacker in 2 with a single stroke of his massive sword, which left Puck rightly impressed. But before he could express his gratitude to Guts for saving his life, the Black Swordsman took off without giving him a second look. Puck had to chase him down to an alleyway and remind him how a savior should properly behave with the people they've saved before expressing his admiration for his skills. The elf calls Dragonslayer what the narrator has conditioned us to believe it truly was, a massive, unwieldy slab of iron. And yet, here Guts was, using it to mow down opponents like they were straw-filled dummies and not flesh and blood men plated in steel armor. Puck then gives Guts his introduction, without the Black Swordsman even asking for it, and this will become a theme with his character later down the line. The blue-haired elf was part of a troupe of traveling performers who were unfortunately attacked by the Coca Castle thugs. Puck was captured and put in a mynah bird's cage, which is a type of starling found in the Indian subcontinent in real life. He was also wineboarded for good measure. He fills Guts in on the fact that the thugs attacked Coca multiple times before the mayor struck a deal with their leader, tribute in exchange for peace. Now that Guts had kicked the hornet's nest, the raids were sure to begin again, and out of concern for his safety, Puck told the Black Swordsman to get out of town as quickly as he could. He was slapped on the bum instead and told he'd be squashed if he touched Guts again for good measure. Puck couldn't comprehend how someone whose actions were so noble could ever behave so ignobly, and chastised Guts for his stuck-up attitude. He haughtily declared his exit from the scene as Coca thugs surrounded the Black Swordsman and threw him in a torture cell. But if you know anything about elves, they don't let things be that easily. Puck returned to Guts to even out the favor by helping him escape from his cell. He used his empathic abilities to put the guard to sleep and stole the key, and had just stumbled into Guts' cell when the Black Swordsman yelled at him to go away. We, of course, know he was actually speaking to the demon child, but Puck being Puck, he didn't notice this and takes it personally. In retrospect, you could call him falling into a puddle of Guts' piss justified given that it was technically the first joke that involved Puck, but we're getting sidetracked here. The elf gives Guts a once-over and comes to the conclusion that he's been through a nightmare, taking into account the fact that he was looking around his cell like a rabid and wounded dog searching for prey. Puck once again chastises Guts for being reckless and tells him he should have listened to the elf when Guts asks him why he was there in the first place. Puck informs him that he was there to repay debt because elves have a strong sense of duty. He goes to check the full extent of Guts' wounds, but the swordsman tries to brush him off once again, yelling at Puck not to touch him. The elf tells Guts to shove the attitude and let him work his magic, which he does by fluttering his wings and producing a healing powder simply called elf dust. Guts is astonished by the fact that his pain was suddenly disappearing, and Puck explained that elves had all sorts of powers. They could heal wounds, fly, sense other people's emotions, and even make people happy. Or at least, that's what Puck's troop leader used to say before he lost his head to the Coca thugs. After hours of making his own introduction, Puck finally asks his savior's name. Guts introduces himself, and Puck asks him why he came to this awful place, gently telling him that he didn't have to answer if he didn't want to. Puck could likely sense Guts' vulnerable state and recalled his previous violent outbursts, putting two and two together and deciding that mindfulness was the way to go. That immediately gives way to unbridled curiosity when Puck sees Guts' brand of sacrifice and starts asking him all sorts of questions about it. Guts rolls the elf off his back and tells him that he'll see what the brand does soon enough, because the master of Coca Castle was about to ride into town and kill him any time now. Guts also notes that the guy would probably also set the town ablaze, and this shocks Puck, who asks him if he intends to drag the townspeople into his fight. The Black Swordsman brushes the question aside as if it were obvious. He says that anyone who gets themselves killed in someone else's battle is a small fry who couldn't survive in the first place. He glances at Puck and remarks that anyone who can't live their lives as they please should die in the first place, and his emotions pour into this empathetic elf. Rage, sadness, fear were mixed into one dark ball of emotion, but there was something else buried deep beneath them. Before Puck could figure that out, he asks Guts why he saved him then, because his words and actions were not adding up. This causes the Black Swordsman to burst out in laughter at the suggestion that he was trying to save Puck from those thugs. He asks Puck who'd risk their lives for a bug like him, which causes the elf to fly straight into his chin in a fit of rage and disappointment. Puck flies out of Guts' cell with tears in his eyes, but he leaves the keys he stole from the guard for the swordsman to use as he wished. The elf witnesses the Coca Castle thugs ravage the town, trampling everything in their path and slaughtering people indiscriminately. Puck instinctively knows that their leader, the Snake Baron, is not human, not because the guy was guzzling blood from a dying person's body, but because he could also sense his apostle nature. His terror transforms into awe when Guts enters the scene and starts clearing out Coca thugs like he was doing target practice with Rickard. The elf is thoroughly impressed by the Black Swordsman's inhuman strength and calls the fight early when Guts unhorses the Snake Baron, but then he witnesses the strength of an apostle, and suddenly you understand why Puck is a part of the story in the first place. The Snake Baron in his released form manages to easily thrash and subdue Guts, picking him up by his arm and reminding him of his place on the food chain. Just as he's about to give him a practical lesson, the Black Swordsman blasts his face to bits with his arm cannon and proceeds to practically torture him while lecturing on the tenacity of the human spirit. Puck sees the scene of carnage that this one man had left behind in his quest to hunt down demons, and utters the title of the series as the closing word of the chapter, Berserk. This first chapter did a great job of establishing Puck's role within the Black Swordsman arc as Guts' healer, reluctant traveling companion, and the voice of the audience, as well as the Black Swordsman's inner conscience. You'll see more examples of the latter in a bit, but this is why a lot of people fell in love with Puck's character in the first place. Much of his dialogue was actually composed of questions that the reader might have had about Guts' character, and so he becomes a convenient tool for exposition and emotion. Puck is the reason why we ask so many of the questions we ask ourselves with regards to Berserk today, as you'll see in the next section. He represents the last fragment of Guts' humanity and acts as a voice for the audience, Puck in the Black Swordsman arc. Despite being called a bug and being spanked without his consent twice, Puck follows Guts anyways because he's so damn intrigued by him. When he catches up with the swordsman, he's greeted with the hostility he has come to expect, but Puck remains cheerful. He asks Guts if he was attacked by wolves or something, given his wounds and the fact that he was manifesting the same for him before coming across him. Puck was about to heal him once more when Guts asked the bug why it was following him. The elf spilled the beans and told the Black Swordsman that his life seemed to be like a living, breathing fairy tale complete with monsters like in the myths and epics. Puck figured that if he stuck around Guts, he'd get to see all kinds of neat things, but his honesty only served to annoy the latter. Guts mocked Puck's elfin sense of duty and tossed him in a puddle before telling him he was in no mood to keep pets. He doesn't like elves, and he doesn't like Puck. When the elf asks Guts why he was so adamant about secluding himself from any positive connection, the swordsman becomes edgelord supreme and tells him it's because he's weak. Guts resents weaklings because all they can do is talk and buzz around people like flies. Makes him want to squash them to death. He turns around and leaves Puck, but not before giving him a knowing glance, and the elf curses the bastard for his arrogance and cynicism. Guts thinks he's rid of Puck once and for all as he walks in the rain, but a caravan being ridden by a priest offers him shelter, and the two traveling companions are united again. He tries to tell the priest off from giving him assistance by telling him he was being pursued by evil spirits, but the priest reassures him that they were being protected by good spirits as Puck emerges from his wagon making faces at Guts. When the black swordsman was drying off in the back, Puck told him to not complain about this unwanted reunion because he found the caravan first, so Guts had no right to complain. The swordsman simply replied by dumping his towel on Puck's head. When the priest's daughter, Colette, offered Guts some wine to warm himself, Puck enthusiastically volunteered as well, and glugged down enough booze to start thinking out loud. When the priest inquired after Guts' sword, and he replied sarcastically by calling it a cooking tool, Puck remarked that maybe Guts should open up a roadside grill so he could earn a better living that way. This earned him yet another smack from the black swordsman, and after a while, the wine took effect, putting Puck to sleep. When he woke up, an incubus's tentacle was draped around him, so naturally he freaks out. He wondered why this entity could have attacked their caravan, which is when Guts explains what the brand of sacrifice does to them and us. It attracts the malign spirits of the dead to their sacrifice, aka Guts, and when it starts bleeding, it's usually a good idea to get as far away from him as you can. This is proven to be true when the skeletons of dead soldiers surround the caravan and start attacking them in waves. They kill the priest's daughter, Colette, and are about to do the same to Guts when Puck suggests they run. There was no way Guts could keep up with so many deceased spirits that couldn't even technically die. Running was the only logical option, but the black swordsman simply told him to run away if he wanted to. All of this came with his territory. Puck watched in awe once again as the black swordsman braved the terrors of his night where other men would have given up long ago. The elf alerts Guts to a possessed Colette, who had put her father out of commission and was now going to do the same to Guts. The black swordsman hesitates for a minute before dispatching her with incredible force and spends the rest of the night fighting like a madman. The next morning, Puck tries to reassure Guts that killing Colette wasn't his fault, because he sensed the momentary guilt Guts had felt right before he put her to rest. But the black swordsman simply laughed and repeated his earlier rhetoric about weaklings. Guts had no time for ants that were inevitably going to be crushed beneath someone's boots, and so guilt wasn't something that stayed with him for too long. What did were the malign spirits of the dead, who taunted Guts as the sun came up, telling him they would never stop coming for him. The black swordsman fires his cannon arm into the air to make the voices go away, and as he leaves, Puck acknowledges the fact that this blood-soaked night of terrors was the world that Guts lived in. Moved by the man's unimaginable struggles, he follows him to his next target, where we learn that Puck is usually great at making friends. When Guts is being attacked by Zondark and men loyal to the slug count, Puck gives him a vital assist by blinding some crossbowmen with his signature Puck Spark, which had not yet been named. Puck flaunts the fact that he saved Guts' life to his face, and Guts immediately repays the favor by saving him from a soldier. He watches the black swordsman's fight with Zondark intently, and is the first to notice the presence of Vargas, who had thrown smoke bombs at the Count's soldiers to rescue our dynamic duo. This man is the first friend that Puck makes in the series, and it really goes to show you just how removed from his own humanity Guts was at this point in time. Vargas was a physician in his former life who had experimented on, amongst other beings, elves. The body of one was preserved in his lab, which is where he took Guts and Puck. Moreover, his face was hideously deformed and gave Puck quite the fright when he first saw it, but it wasn't because of some disease, it was because of the Count. Vargas gave Guts and Puck the story about how he became what they saw today, and despite having been terrified of the old man a few moments ago, Puck is filled with empathy. As an empath, it's very easy for him to understand and sort of synchronize with someone else's emotions, which is how he makes friends so easily. When he hears Vargas' story, Puck is overcome with emotion at just how much this man has been through, which is why he's extra pissed at Guts for treating him with disrespect despite knowing his history. The elf and the former physician are filled in on what a Behelit is and a God-hand is by the black swordsman, which is when we meet Puck's second friend and first possession, Becky. That's the name he gives the Behelit Vargas took from Guts, and he is incredibly possessive of it. Did you know that Becky's favorite food is cheese? Puck will tell you at every possible occasion. He will also call out Guts for being an absolute prick, which is what he does when the latter kicks over Vargas and calls him a monster for his appearance. Before Puck can launch into a full-on tirade, the lab is attacked by Zondark, who is now a pseudo-apostle. The elf witnesses the fight from inside a skull. Puck might have become a casualty if it hadn't been for Vargas, who saved him from falling beams with his own body, thus earning himself a magical friend. The former physician was worried about Guts because at this point he couldn't even see Zondark's attacks, but Puck saw Guts blocking every blow and realized that he was a master swordsman, filling him with even more admiration than before. The Black Swordsman has a conversation with the Count via his pseudo and takes his leave of Vargas after taking his behelit, but this is where Puck really comes to shine. Earlier, when Guts kicked Vargas over, he told him weaklings who couldn't even avenge their loved ones should just die. But Puck thinks that people should go on living. He doesn't know much about life, but he thinks looking forward towards the future instead of trying to avenge the past was more important. He apologizes for getting his emotions all mixed up and makes his exit. Puck once again chastises Guts for his rudeness to a man who helped them on their journey, and once again he is met by the Black Swordsman's typically cynical answer. So this time, he decides to take matters into his own hands and show him exactly how this whole savior thing was supposed to work. When Vargas was discovered and condemned to death by the Count, Puck bravely, or stupidly depending on who you ask, tries to save the physician from a gruesome death. Of course, he failed and was captured by the Count, who then gifted him to his estranged daughter, Teresia. Guts predicted that this is exactly what would happen if he himself had tried to save Vargas, but Puck noticed that the Black Swordsman identified with Vargas's story. Despite putting on a tough exterior, on the inside, Guts was truly motivated by a self-destructive sense of fear, and Puck would learn its source soon enough. After becoming friends with Teresia and hearing her tragic life story, Puck resolves to save the girl by any means he can. He doesn't realize that the cost of the same might be destroying her innocence. Puck's ultimate goal of freeing Teresia is accomplished here. The door to her bedchambers is broken one day, and the girl finally escapes into the outside world for the first time in 7 years. But that door was broken open because of Guts' fight with the Count in his apostle form, which means that Teresia finally saw her father's true self, which he had kept from her all this time. Puck was terrified of the Count's monstrous form at first, preferring to stay out of sight as he duked it out with the Black Swordsman. But when Guts seemingly flatlines, Puck can't hold it in anymore. He rebukes the Count's assertion that humans are fragile things by calling him one of those fragile humans himself. Puck reminds the Count of the inhuman sacrifice he made in order to obtain his current power, and the effect it had on his relationship with his daughter. The Count is actually taken aback by his words, and offers to spare the elf for speaking so eloquently for his kind, but that offer is rescinded when he realizes how much Puck has meddled in his life. First, the elf flies off with his behelit, and evades capture for an annoyingly long period. Second, he turns the Count's daughter against him, because Teresia comes into the throne room looking for Puck, and finds her monstrous father instead. The elf braces himself for death as his body is frozen by sheer shock, but he is saved at the last possible moment by Guts. Puck is overjoyed by this initially, and yet his joy turns into ashes in his mouth when Guts uses Teresia as leverage to land a lethal blow on the apostle. He is further horrified when the Black Swordsman practically tortures the Count in front of his daughter, and Puck screams at Guts to stop it, which is when Becky arrives and takes them all into the interstice where the God Hand resides. This is where Puck first sees the man who is the object of Guts' hatred, Griffith. Though he exists in the astral world as the fifth God Hand, Femto, this man used to be human, and from the intensity with which Guts hurls himself at him, Puck deduces that these two must have had some horrid history with each other. The elf also witnesses the truth about the Slug Count's ascension into apostlehood, and if you want to know more about that, then check out his origins on our channel. Puck's fear paralysis is broken by Guts, who tells him to heal his right hand so he can swing his sword again, but he goes back into it when Femto summons the Abyss. Puck starts squirming from the sheer evil that resides within the Abyss, which is where the souls of those who devote themselves to a demonic existence end up going to. As Femto lectures the Count about his fate should he not sacrifice his daughter, Puck realizes that Guts is also going to eventually end up in that Abyss as his fate was tangled with demonkind. The elf watches as the spirits of the dead drag the Count's soul into the Abyss with them, and is shocked to see Vargas amongst them, but his fear turns into concern when the dead come for Guts, thanks to his brand of sacrifice. The Black Swordsman fires a parting shot at Femto, which the latter stops with his space-manipulating powers, but it also saves him from the Abyss. As the God Hand departs from the interstice, Puck notices the look Guts and Griffith exchange with one another. Back in the real world, he immediately goes to check on Teresia, but the girl has been broken by her experiences. She tries to slap Puck away and screams that she wants to be released from her fears, when Guts tells her to do it herself. The elf slaps the Black Swordsman for his insensitive words, and it seems to hurt him more than anything the Count put him through. Puck makes Guts realize just how inhumane his words were in light of Teresia's suffering, so he softens his speech but maintains his stance. He tosses a knife towards her and urges her to do what she wants to with her her life, and Puck despairs at how much Guts means those words. The elf stops the girl from following through on Guts' suggestion, but just then, the floor beneath them caves in. Despite all his cynical talk, Guts saves Tiresia's life with the Dragon Slayer, and shows remorse for hurting her inadvertently, though you have to be really good at deducing meaning from expressions to notice. Puck, of course, goes to heal his friend's wounds immediately, but this mercy was poison to the girl. Tiresia blames Guts for all her woes and vows to kill him, which the Black Swordsman welcomes. Guts tells her he will be ready for her whenever she is, but Puck notices the deep look of despair that falls across his face, which he hides rather quickly. Despite putting on an alpha exterior, Guts was a man tormented by pain on the inside, and Puck was cognizant of this. This is why he acts as an emotional echo chamber and occasional comic relief, really balancing out the tone of Berserk in these early chapters. He wouldn't show up again until the eclipse itself is underway, but it was clear that when he did, things would change. That change itself, however, has been rather divisive. Black Swordsman's protege and a chestnut-shaped nuisance. How Puck became the most hated character in Berserk. Puck wouldn't show up in the story after the conclusion of the Black Swordsman arc all the way up until the advent of Griffith's Eclipse, though he was mentioned once. In chapter 21, Judo gives Casca a pouch of elf dust which he got from an elf he met when he used to work for a traveling entertainment troupe. The visage we see in this panel heavily implies that it was Puck, but it's pretty much confirmed in chapter 74 when we see Rickert close in on the site of the eclipse. After surviving the slaughter that was orchestrated by wayward apostles in chapter 52 thanks to Skull Knight, Rickert finds his way to what is very likely the same traveling troupe Judo used to work for, because he too receives a pouch of elf dust from the troupe's leader, and turns out that the elf that is with them is none other than Puck. As Rickert walks away from their caravan, an old fortune teller asks Puck why he doesn't see the boy off, to which the elf asks whether she had forgotten how Rickert reacted when he first saw Puck. After a bit of back and forth, they decide to see the boy's future, and the fortune teller realizes that Rickert has a role to play in Griffith's Eclipse and the future of this very world. Puck asks her why they can't just stop him from going, and she thinks to herself that it's because he has a significant destiny. At that moment, the moon descends upon the sun and marks the beginning of the eclipse. Puck, who saw this from the top of the troop leader's head, bets that some great god or devil must be peeking through that hole, unaware of just how true his words were. From this point on, he likely stayed with this traveling troupe for around 2 years before the balding leader was killed by the Coca thugs and Puck was saved by Guts. The events of the Black Swordsman arc follow after this, which we have discussed already, and Miura ties the two timelines together with the first chapter of the Conviction arc, titled Black Swordsman Again, which sees the more savage side of Guts make a comeback after a long time. Though Puck doesn't physically appear in the chapter, he does throw a burdock at one of the bandits trying to abuse a girl named Jill. After Guts takes care of the bandits in the haunted tree, Puck makes his presence known by throwing a burdock at one of the branches about to attack Jill and calling it the Death Strike Bloody Needle. Guts is mildly annoyed at the fact that Puck, is still hanging around him, but the girl somehow loses her mind at seeing the elf. She starts muttering about the Misty Valley, and at the end of the chapter, we learn that who she was really talking about was the apostle Rosine, whose pseudo-apostles resembled elves. Puck retained much of his character from the Black Swordsman arc here, as he constantly chastised Guts for his blunt behavior with a child like Jill, but it was also here that the reason for Puck hate started to proliferate. After helping Guts defeat Rosine's elves and learning the location of the apostle herself, Puck follows the Black Swordsman into the Misty Valley. As usual, he's lecturing Guts about how he should be treating the people he ends up saving, and after noticing his wounds, Puck moves in to help him. The Black Swordsman reminds him that he did not take the elf on as a pet, and that he should get lost. Puck thinks to himself that he isn't a pet though, and then utters the sentence that explains why he becomes an annoying chestnut after this encounter. Puck tells Guts that if he wasn't with the Black Swordsman, this story would be too dark, and you need some color in your life. This isn't just Puck telling Guts to lighten up. It's also Miura telling his readers that Puck is about to become way more comedic than they're used to. Because sure, the OG member of the Black Swordsman party retains his services as an empath and a medic for the man after which it's named, and shows his past seriousness in certain instances, which we will get to in our next section. Puck almost exclusively becomes Chestnut Puck from the Conviction arc onwards, and this is where his character practically goes to die. It is subtle when it's just him and Guts, with Chestnut Puck surfacing more during Puck's relaxed relaxing moments in the Misty Valley and more frantic moments during the fight with Rosine. But after meeting Isidro, nearly every appearance by Puck is in his chibi chestnut form, breaking the fourth wall more often than not just to give the reader a joke to laugh at. Remember when we called him the Yoda to Isidro's Luke? That wasn't just an analogy, as Puck fervently takes to teaching the boy his personal elf dimension style. Miura has even drawn several fourth wall breaking panels where he has dressed Puck up as Yoda to make sure the joke is as prominent as the action in the book. The moment when he uses Puck Spark against Mozgus's twin disciples feels like such a big deal, not because we didn't know Puck could do it, it's because he spent so much time being goofy we forgot he could be serious. And this only becomes more exaggerated when Isidro meets Shirke, because Puck and Ivalira develop a relationship that mirrors the one their closest friends have with one another. As a result, the latter half of Berserk is filled with instances where Isidro and Puck are solely there for comedic commentary, with no other actual plot purpose. We get why this pisses off so many people in a story whose cornerstone is having an insanely tight and complex storyline, but we also appreciate these moments. Berserk is a story that is extremely dark, even by dark fantasy standards. People are getting killed in the story as an afterthought, and you can bet your butt that every imaginable form of violation is in it. While it's true that the early days of Berserk were perhaps darker than the material we've been getting Conviction Arc onwards, we'd argue that's precisely why the change to Chestnut Puck doesn't offend us. Every great piece of fiction is not remembered because it does one thing extremely well. Some are remembered for being a buffet of unexpected pleasures that balance out the many themes within the story. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series is considered to be one of the darkest traditional fantasy stories in mainstream media, but if you read the books, it's actually more funny than scary. Martin balances out his inner Stephen King by channeling the spirit of Don Rickles with some of the zingers he crafts in his books, and that is why they are as memorable as they are. We don't have a problem with Miura using Puck as a comedic character at all, because when the material gets too heavy, our blue-haired boy gives us the perfect amount of levity to keep ourselves balanced. But that's a personal opinion, and we will also address a possible narrative reason for Puck's diminished role, the introduction of a proper magic system. As we've noted earlier in this video, Miura likely intends Berserk to have a hard fantasy setting given the way the characters interact with Puck and Guts during the Black Swordsman arc, and how they behave from the Golden Age prequel onwards. As the story kept progressing, he must have felt that at a certain point it was going to be inevitable to involve magic in his story, and that's how Shirke and Flora become a major part of the story. After Guts & Co. return from Kliphoff, the job of anchoring the Black Swordsman to his humanity falls to Shirke, and she is the only person who can keep his ego from collapsing when he uses the Berserker armor, and so Puck was practically out of a job. Berserk's magic system explains all of his abilities and grants them to Shirke and Farnese as well, the two mages of our story, so Puck's relevance to the plot diminishes quite a bit. He's restricted to being a wisecracking chestnut who puffs out his chest at every small accomplishment, and secretly conspires with Farnese's brother to usurp the throne of Elfhelm, which is where he advises Guts to take Cascatu after Godot's ore mine is destroyed. Even after reaching his homeland, Puck doesn't exactly go back to what he used to be, preferring to team up with Isidro and teasing and harassing the young witches of Elfhelm instead, including Shirke. If everything we've just told you has convinced you that Chestnut Puck is a character assassination as well, then hold on, because we're not talking about his importance to the story yet, and trust us, there is a reason why he's still around. Puck could be the final straw that breaks Guts' humanity. What will happen to Puck now that Elfhelm is gone? If you guys were confused as to why Puck was a chestnut for so long, then don't worry about being behind or something, because even he didn't know he wasn't actually a chestnut. In chapter 203, titled Elementals, we learn that Puck is actually a wind sprite that is related to the sylphs that powers Serpico's cloak and sword. Being a pixie, he was a descendant of the wind elemental, which is ruled over by the elemental king of the east. This revelation goes straight to his head, of course, and he starts commanding the sylphs on Serpico's sword and cloak to obey their commander's orders, the commander being Puck, of course. Before coming across the trolls and arriving at Flora's Spirit Tree mansion, it was Puck who told Guts to head towards Elfhelm if he wanted true safety for Casca, and his suggestion was backed up by none other than the Skull Knight. Sure, he tacked on the incentive that the ruler of Elfhelm might help Guts to solve his Casca problem, but the original idea came from Puck. He was also the first, and so far, one one of the only characters to notice that Skull Knight's ode resembles an elf's, and his backstory could actually be the prologue to Berserk like he claims. Let us explain. Chapter 342 is where Puck becomes useful once again, but only to a certain degree. As the seahorse docks at Skellig Island, he muses about coming back to his utopian home after a long time. When Puck had told Guts about Elfhelm, he claimed that he left because he got bored, despite it being an elfin paradise. In chapter 342, he tells Isidro, Isma, and Shirke his backstory, and it is slightly different from boredom. The tale of the brave elf Puck began one day as he was fighting off a nasty seagull. His name was Jonah, but he was better known as Albatross the Monster, because he was a threat to the island's peace. Their battle raged through land, air, and sea, with the pride of both their species on the line. Eventually, their enmity devolved into a rivalry, and Jonah allowed Puck to hitch a ride on his back to Elfhelm. But along the way, a tragedy occurred. It's unclear whether Puck actually says this part out loud, but he fell asleep on the seagull's back and was tossed overboard onto a ship, which brought him to the realms of men. Ivalira is amazed by the story, and Isidro doesn't buy it, but Puck proves that he did in fact stay at Elfhelm by guiding the party to the island as their sole guide. He also points out the many traps that protect Elfhelm from outsiders like their group, though he often does it at the last possible moment, much to Isidro's chagrin. Puck is recognized on sight by every mage and guru of Elfhelm, including Gedfring, who says something interesting about the elf's fated destiny. Apparently, the Flower Storm Monarch had received an oracle about their arrival on the island, but she saw it through the medium of Puck. A small wind whirling out from this island would draw in many fates and return as a tempest. Puck, of course, immediately gloats about his destiny-entwining existence as Puck the Storm. But this is an important thing to note, and not a chance happening, as Ivalira exclaims. When Puck meets Danon, the guru notes that he's been on a long journey, and he later introduces the party to his relatives, Pick, Pook, Peck, and Poke, who are just as mischievous and carefree as him. After entering the Flower Storm Monarch's Cherry Blossom Spirit Tree, Puck helps Magnifico with his plan to create an elf market by declaring himself king and announcing that he had sold the land to the humans. He was immediately trapped by the Flower Storm Monarch's guards, and Puck pleaded with his toady Magnifico to bail him out of there. As Magnifico prepared his own escape, their paths were blocked by Danon, who revealed herself to be the Flower Storm Monarch. Danon sentenced Puck and Magnifico to the harsh judgment of helping the brownies clean up for an entire day before proceeding to help Casca regain her mind via the Corridor of Dreams. No sooner had the branded girl regained her sanity than Elfhelm was attacked by Griffith and Zod, and the entire island was cut off from the physical world, retreating into the astral world. Initially, we thought that Puck was going to disappear as well, because Yzma did, and both of them are technically magical creatures. But for some reason, Puck and Ivalira managed to stay in the physical world with their persons of attachment. As of this moment, he's aboard the Seahorse, which itself is trying to survive a massive whirlpool caused by Elfhelm's destruction. But it's the statement that Guru Gedfring made about his return that concerns us more here. Puck jokingly called his story of randomly being carried off by a seagull the prequel to Berserk, but that isn't quite far off from the truth. The fact is that his departure and eventual return were both foretold, and what's more, it appears that his own fate has taken on a more significant flavor now that it is linked to so many others. Puck is a character who has, by chance, met everyone important to Guts' journey. Judo, Casca, Rickert, Erica, Godot, Isidro, Farnace, Shirke, Skull Knight, Serpico, Roderick, Magnifico. These are just a few we can name off the top of our heads. And because this is Berserk, we know there is nothing like chance, because all lies within the flow of causality. So if Puck was fated to have these encounters with these people, then it's not an exaggeration to say that he is the axis of the Black Swordsman party. Gedfring's statement that Puck would leave as a gust and return as a tempest could be a reference to his spiritual growth, or the significant nature of his fate gathering more wind. He was a wind elemental after all, but the idea that Puck is who makes all of these fates intersect implies that he will also be their undoing, and this is why he's still in the story. Guts has never admitted it to himself, but since day one, Puck has been the only one keeping him somewhat sane. That role expanded to his entire party after a time, but their bond still exists. It hasn't been deleted to make space for Isidro. Given the fact that Berserk operates on a "and then things got even worse" protocol, it is pretty much guaranteed that Puck is going to suffer some kind of horrific fate that will push Guts thoughts into making whatever big decision it is that he clearly has to make. Because at this point in time, Guts is primed to become an apostle. He has lost everything to Griffith, feels like all his actions were meaningless, and Becky is in his satchel the last time we checked. We're not saying that he will become one, because as Miura said himself, that would take away from this human struggler's story, but it does give you an idea about how on edge he is. If something were to happen to Puck, after everything that occurred during the destruction of Elfhelm, we don't think Shirke or the Moonlight Boy could pull him out of his berserker rage. And what happens next is why Puck, despite being so heavily nerfed from the Conviction arc onwards, is still one of our favorite characters. His fate is intrinsically linked to that of every member of the Black Swordsman group. So what happens when he himself passes away? Does that change? Do they all become leaping fish in the stream of fate like Guts, or do they flow downriver with the torrent of evil? Sadly, we're going to have to wait for the next chapter to find that out, and there's no guarantee when that will happen. Marvelous verdict. So that's it for this one. You probably didn't think we could do 30 minutes on Puck, but there's actually so much stuff we haven't even touched upon because it would not be relevant for the topic at hand. Puck is definitely one of Berserk's most divisive characters, but he's also by far one of its most memorable ones as well. His mischief, innocence, bravado, and Deadpool-like antics are what personally kept us reading through the nightmare that is Berserk, and for that, we could never hate him. We hope that the Sylph Commander finds his own fate out in this world soon enough, and can do something to avoid it, because that kind of stuff doesn't normally go down well for a person. But if he doesn't, then we just hope Kujimori and the team at Studio Gaga manage to pull off the inevitable character development moment with utmost grace and respect. Puck is comic relief done right in our opinion, and we're waiting to hear yours as well. So head on down to the comments section and let us know which Puck is your favorite. Serious empath Puck or goofy chestnut Puck. And don't worry, we won't bop you on the head with a burdock for giving the wrong answer. As always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. This has been Corey Whelan for Marvelous Videos. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.